So let me begin by welcoming you all to this workshop on refugees in Syria and in Iraq. This project is part of the program of the Institute for Iraqi Studies here at Boston University. It's one of the series of workshops we've held on a number of topical themes. None of them have been as compelling, arguably, as this one. Of course, with the Institute for Iraqi Studies, but as you know, in some ways, the prologue to Syria is Iraq. So we have two components to the program today. We'll focus on Syria to begin with, but then look at the more, thankfully, historical case of the Iraqi refugees from the 1991 period, particularly the aftermath of the 1991 war and the Intifada that followed, and of course the refugee situation in Iraq in the context of the 2003 invasion and subsequent occupation. In Iraq, at the height of the Iraqi mayhem in 2006 and 2007, upwards of 1 out of 6 Iraqis were displaced either internally or externally as refugees. Unfortunately, Syria has today reached that rather unfortunate benchmark as well, where approximately 1 out of every 6 Syrians is displaced by the bloodshed that's going on. We don't yet know which chapter of this book we're in, whether or not Lebanon over the course of its civil war, perhaps other episodes in Iraq, are somehow epilogues for the Syrian case. In many ways, we hope not. But certainly the question of how strong the members of state will be in Syria, the strength of state institutions, the permanence of dislocations, and so on, these are all issues to be addressed in the future. For now, we have an immediate crisis at hand affecting real people, men, women, and children in very substantial ways, so we hope to come to grips with that this morning. Our first presentation will be by my colleague Vicki Kelber, who will give us an overview of the Syrian situation, and we'll turn over the floor to Vicki.
As Professor Norton said, my name is Vicki Kelber, and I'm going to be providing some context for the discussion of the Syrian refugees, as well as providing background information on the scale and impact of the refugee crisis on the region. So getting right into it with the raw data, there's about 1.175 million refugees as of the 23rd of this month. I checked that this morning, and it's about 1.22 million as of this morning, so it's only going to get larger. The UN estimates that it's going to grow by 2 to 3 times by the end of this year, but given the difficulty of registering refugees, the actual number is going to grow by 3 to 4 times by the end of this year. We've got about 55 NGOs operating on the regional response plan to service the refugees, along with the UNHCR. They're also trying to service about 2.5 to 3 million refugees, but as my colleague who's just returned from Syria informs me, that's probably closer to about 4 million IDPs. In need of assistance within Syria is at least 6 million people out of a total population of about 20 million. Obviously, there hasn't been a census in Syria for some years, so it's kind of difficult to get a real number. But even with that 20 million number, that means that over a quarter of the population of Syria is in need of assistance. That's led to the $1.5 billion appeal by the UNHCR, which is the largest aid appeal in the UN's history. Taking a look at this growth graph of refugees, you can see that we've entered the exponential growth phase of the conflict. That means that the rate of arrival is only going to increase as we go on. That's important because the refugees arriving now have been living in war-torn Syria for almost 2 years. They're the most battle-scarred physically and emotionally, and they're arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As you can see from the age breakdown, about 51% of the refugees are children under the age of 18, and about 75% total are women and children. So the most vulnerable people are now arriving in the host countries. This map, courtesy of the UNHCR, pretty accurately shows the distribution of refugees in the region. In the interest of time, I'm only going to be speaking about the direct neighbors of Syria, so Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. You also have a map on the handout that I provided, which shows you where specifically they're dispersed within these countries. It's a little difficult to tell, but the map actually differentiates between the actual camps and the urban areas where they're staying. You can see on the handout that about 62% of the refugees are not living in camps, they're just living in the urban areas of the host countries, making recording them and providing services even more difficult for the UNHCR. The funding appeal is also 69% underfunded, leaving a gap of $725 million. There have been a lot of pledges, but not a lot of deliveries. Now, the Middle East has a double-edged experience with refugees. Being the largest refugee host region in the world at the start of the Syrian conflict, perhaps no other region in the world is more seasoned in dealing with refugee flows. On the other hand, because the refugee populations were already so large, capacity has already been stretched to the brink, meaning that international aid is definitely needed. Getting into specifics about the host countries, I just want to note that in every single country, access to basic resources is the primary problem faced by the refugees. So I'm not going to keep repeating myself, but access to health and schools especially is extremely lacking in all of these communities. There are about 324,000 registered and waiting to register refugees in Jordan, but the Jordanian government estimates the number is actually closer to 420,000, placing them at 5% of Jordan's total population. Jordan obviously already has quite a large population of permanent Palestinians, about 1.9 million, and they've already closed their borders to Palestinians trying to flee from Syria. There are 3 refugee camps in the north of Jordan: Al-Zatri, Al-Azraq, and Rabaa al-Sarhan. Al-Zatri is the only one that has actually been finished, and it's housing about 155,000 people. It was meant to house about 80,000, 90,000 tops, so the overcrowding has already led to protests and unrest with refugees demanding either to be let out into the urban areas, which the Jordanian government is loath to do, or to finish the camps and start new ones. The main issues in Jordan are border access, because Jordan is one of the only countries that has recently threatened to close the border given an influx of refugees, but hasn't stated what exactly that influx would be. So we don't have any assurance that refugees will continue to be able to have access to Jordan. There's also been unrest in the camps, as I've already mentioned, as well as an ongoing political crisis in Jordan between East Bank and West Bankers. Jordan has a unique situation for post-conflict prospects of returning the refugees. About 91% of them actually come from the Daraa region and the surrounding areas. So all Jordan really needs to do to convince them to return is invest directly in Daraa and make sure that the reconstruction there happens at a fairly rapid pace. The next country I'm going to be speaking about is Turkey. Turkey is relatively better equipped to handle its influx of refugees. Has about 260,000 refugees currently residing in the country, although the government thinks it's closer to 400,000. But it also has 17 of the 23 total refugee camps in the region. So that means that they've spent $600 million of their own money to build and upkeep these camps, and that number has grown. That actually was from January, so they're thinking it's actually closer to about $1 billion. Main issues in Jordan, cross-border attacks are particularly concerning. They've already engaged with the Syrian army as well as some of the rebels. We also have increasing unrest in the Kurdish regions as a result of this. I'm going to revisit that later. And obviously, recently though, we had news of a possible truce with the PKK, which would be a really important step forward actually in Turkish and Kurdish relations. International funding continues to be a key concern in Turkey since they're putting up so much of their own money. And there's also 3 IDP camps on the border with 45,000 to 65,000 people waiting for entry into Turkey. The capacity of Turkey, obviously, to absorb these people is only going to grow less because these camps, they've stopped construction on new camps, essentially. They're not willing to spend more of their own money. The next country is particularly concerning and is, in my opinion, the most likely country to be ignited in its own civil conflict by the refugee crisis itself. Lebanon has about 375,000 registered and waiting to register refugees right now, but the government thinks that it's closer to 1 million. Now, the reason for this vast discrepancy in comparison to the other official versus government estimates is because there are no refugee camps for Syrians in Lebanon. Obviously, with the population of about 400,000, although probably less Palestinians in 12 camps, they are really not wanting to create a permanent refugee situation such as the one they already have on their hands. That's led to a much higher level of Lebanese trying to absorb these Syrians within their communities in the north. But as resources have dried up, the Syrians have been moving into the interior of the country. One of the main problems in Lebanon is that the north of the country is the poorest. So the area expected to absorb the most people, provide them employment, provide them basic services is the least equipped to do so. Shelter is also an overriding concern. Refugees aren't even allowed to build tents in Lebanon, so they have absolutely no way of constructing shelter when there is none to be had. They aren't even given refugee status, instead being referred to as displaced Syrians, because again, the government doesn't want to commit itself to providing basic services to these people. About 40 to 50% of the refugees are unregistered in Lebanon, meaning that the UN and its related agencies are extremely challenged by the task of providing services to these people. Of course, the main issue that I brought up when I introduced Lebanon is the tensions and unrest that are likely to continue to result from this crisis. There have already been violence, kidnappings of refugees, and resentment is only going to build as more refugees try to enter the country. This culminated in the assassination of Wissam al-Hassam earlier this year, as well as the resignation of Prime Minister Makati. And you can see that earlier when I looked at this map, all of the refugees were concentrated in the north and the east of the country, and you can see how in just the last month they've moved into the interior and the south. Obviously, of particular interest to us today is the refugee situation in Iraq. There's about 117,000 refugees in Iraq from Syria right now. Obviously, that's a much lower number than the surrounding countries. However, Iraq is dealing with its own ongoing civil conflict. There's about 1 million Iraqi IDPs estimated to still be within Iraq itself, and there's not very many resources, especially employment, for the Syrian refugees once they arrive. There are 3 official camps in Iraq, Domiz, Al-Qaim, and Al-Walid. The latter 2 are still under construction, and actually of particular concern is the complete lack of access of international agencies to these 2 camps. In Domiz, in Dohuk, the conditions are reported to be relatively, and we're talking about relative to Al-Zatri in Jordan, relatively better. Main issues in Iraq, again, the ongoing civil conflict threatens to flare up at any moment, especially because a lot of these refugees are going into Al-Anbar province. Speaking of the sensitive regions of Iraq, Al-Anbar has been particularly supportive of the Syrian insurgency because during the insurgency in Al-Anbar earlier this decade, the Syrians on the other side provided them with a lot of support. So especially in the Abdullaim tribe, there's a feeling that there is a lot of aid owed to the insurgency in Syria. The recent cross-border attacks in Al-Anbar have raised concerns that Iraq, again, is going to devolve into its own civil conflict as a result of the crisis. This culminated earlier this month on the 3rd when there are about 40 Syrian soldiers massacred as they made their way back across the border. So you can see there where the refugee camps are. They're all in the east and the north. So what are our main points of concern for the refugees? Camp-to-urban relocation has been a serious problem, making it very difficult to track these populations and provide them with services. Registration ties into that. Recently, Save the Children Syria gave a very optimistic projection that says 70 to 80% of refugees are being registered. Now, even that optimistic projection means that we are currently dealing with about 1.47 to 1.68 million refugees. So obviously a much larger number than the 1.22 that we already have registered and on record. The capacity and funding of the regional response plan is being stretched to the brink, and again, they're $725 million short of what they say they need for the next couple of months. The legal status of the refugees is also very contentious in Lebanon and Jordan especially. As I mentioned, Lebanon will not even accord them refugee status, absolving them of responsibility for these vulnerable populations. Resources in every single country are extremely low in the areas that have absorbed refugees. They're drinking dirty water, they're eating old food, spoiled food, there's no shelter for them, they're making it out of whatever they can find, and especially healthcare is extremely lacking. A report that came out yesterday in the Huffington Post of someone who had recently visited Iraq said that it had been months since a mobile healthcare clinic had visited any of the populations in the north. Violence is also a constant concern for the refugees, and especially considering what they've fled, it is a sad fact that they come to host countries where the situation is no better. There have been cross-border attacks in a lot of countries, intercommunal violence with the local populations, family and sexual violence, and 71% of the refugees are women and children, so these are the people most vulnerable to that kind of violence. There's also reports of widespread prostitution in the camps. This is because there's no employment opportunities available for the Syrian refugees, and thus they're forced to take whatever means possible to earn a living for their family. The host countries have a different set of concerns. They're mostly concerned about the fact that the refugees could be carriers of this conflict, meaning that they're going to become radicalized because of the conflict, perhaps bringing fighters across the borders. There's definitely been restrictions on young men being able to cross into these neighboring countries. The region also has the indicators of the worst forms of spillover from civil conflict: shared religious and ethnic identities, shared problems that led to the conflict, fragile regimes, porous borders, as well as a divided population. Even if post-Assad Syria achieves some modicum of stability, what the issue is going to be is that all of these cities are still going to be destroyed, and the Syrian population is still going to be divided over the future of the country. So these populations could become semi-permanent. A recent RRP meeting in Beirut to revise the 2013 plan noted that we've already surpassed the numbers for June 2013 that were projected in January. So these countries obviously mainly concerned with the fact that they might have to deal with these refugees for years to come. The one point of hope on the horizon is that all of the aid agencies working in the neighboring countries have remarked on the Syrian refugees' extreme willingness and desire to return home, especially in the perspective of other refugees populations that they've dealt with in the past. This isn't that surprising given the conditions in the host countries. However, even if post-Assad Syria does have some amount of stability, as I've mentioned, there's really not going to be very many incentives for these refugees to return. Unless international actors can provide strong incentives like cash assistance programs, reconstruction, and other such programs that have been proved to work to convince refugees to return home, these populations are going to stay in their host countries, much to their chagrin.